Hey, Kevin.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's good to talk to you today. We should probably introduce ourselves for folks who don't know us. I'm Greg Marx. I work at the Columbia Journalism Review, where I edit our United States project, which sort of monitors, critiques, hopefully tries to support accountability journalism at local news organizations around the country.
Great. And I'm Kevin Davis, CEO and Executive Director of the Investigative News Network, a 501c3 organization that is focused on finding the collective opportunities to support nonprofit newsrooms around the United States and globally.
Cool. And by way of disclosure, we should mention that INN and my project at CJR and Blogging Heads all get money from a foundation called the Democracy Fund.
That's right.
Um, so, so, um, so Kevin, you gave us a little bit of a sense of what INN does, but can you talk a little bit about, I guess, how long you guys have been around, what your membership looks like, and I think maybe we can go from there into sort of a discussion of the role that nonprofit journalism is playing in the American media landscape and how that might be changing.
Terrific. Sure. So INN was founded in July 2009. It was founded at the Pacantico Center under the auspices of the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation. And there were about, I think, 27 nonprofit organizations represented there, as well as interested parties. And the meeting and the foundation of Investigative News Network was a direct reaction to the increase in number of nonprofit news organizations that were starting. And the thinking was at the
Which
time, and
itself maybe had something to do with like a crisis in the commercial media landscape at the moment.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that a lot of these organizations were founded by individuals or teams that had previously been working principally in print, but not just in print, in broadcast as well. And those I teams were being let go by commercial organizations that were feeling the crunch that we have seen since then. And so, it's interesting because journalists have aspired to be investigative journalists and work their way up to it. But the news organizations that employed them saw investigative journalism, unfortunately, often as commercially non-viable. So these folks got together and they decided, let's form this organization. And the idea being is that we are here to sort of aid and abet in every way possible the nonprofit news organizations that qualify for membership. So what that really effectively means, I'll talk about membership in a second, is that we provide everything from back office support, so things like technology, uh, preferred rates and insurance, fiscal sponsorship for organizations that are just getting started that don't yet have their 501c3. We also help with editorial collaboration. We provide data services and we wrangle different players both internally and externally to help increase the impact and reach of these projects. And we also do a lot of business training because at the end of the day, INN is here to help these nonprofits learn how to fish for themselves, not to do the fishing for them. Just real quick on membership, to
Mm-hmm.
qualify to be a member of INN, it was decided that organizations need to be nonprofit. So what that means is either 501c3 or a fiscally sponsored project or project of a 501c3. They need to be nonpartisan in their journalism. Ethical journalism suggests, of course, that you should have no agenda going in or out of it. And we ask the members to be transparent about their funding. All donors of $1,000 and above should be listed publicly for people to be able to scrutinize. So that's sort of the background on INN.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, and have you guys, I imagine you guys have probably continued to grow, yeah, since that
Yeah.
time. I mean, so what do you, I guess, how have you seen the nonprofit landscape, nonprofit media landscape change since 2009?
That's a great question. So when in 2009 there was like 27 organizations, as I mentioned. We are now about 100. So there's always a little bit of sort of in and out. New organizations are forming, but frankly, some organizations are either merging or often going dormant or no longer sort of going concern. So the I think back in 2009 and 2010 and even 11, there were a number of national foundations that were interested in planting seedlings, as it were. There was a lot of experimentation. So there was money, grant money from these national foundations principally to help get these projects started. Because at the time, there really wasn't a clear path towards sustainability. But everybody knew that there was an issue here that needed to be met. I think that the big difference today is that the funding for startups, for new nonprofits, is no longer coming from these national foundations. That in fact, that kind of funding is more likely to come locally for community-based organizations, or from individuals or topic-based foundations or community foundations. So that's a big difference, because I think a number of organizations started with the idea like, well, look, they're giving us grants. Let's continue the kind of reporting we were doing when we were commercially worked at a commercial institution. But now we've moved towards this maturation where these nonprofits are expected not only to be able to produce public interest journalism in this nonprofit model, but they have to have a path to sustainability. They have to have a diversification of revenues, and they have to be running effective businesses, because people are just not willing anymore to put money in experiment as much as they want to put money into things that look like they have a good chance of succeeding.
So in terms of like the sort of shift away from national foundations, just to clarify, were you saying that there's a greater emphasis on sort of like local? Certainly, there people are trying sort of experimenting with sort of reader revenue or sort of member revenue models. There's Texas Tribune is doing sponsored content. I don't know how many nonprofits are doing stuff like that. Has there also been sort of a shift towards a greater focus on local foundations or sort of local sort of institutional benefactors besides some of the national players?
Yeah, I think, to back up a little bit, I think that what we're recognizing now is that there is no one major revenue stream, right? So, and this parallels, I think, commercial media too. The way we look at revenue right now, there needs to be a mix, and the mix really should be foundations, and those foundations, or philanthropy, excuse me. So those are typically philanthropists, individuals that care about the community or care about journalism or care about the topic of the journalism, or community foundations that are focused on the community. And the idea is, like the national foundations, like the Knight Foundation principally, are working to train and frankly put some financial incentives for community foundations to focus on creating these organizations and institutions within those communities. So that's sort of the on the big philanthropy side. There's also a push towards, whenever possible, some level of earned revenue, some level of earned income. And because these are mission-driven nonprofits, they're even though they're using often the exact same type of revenue streams as commercial news, it still has to be consistent with the mission, right? And so what I mean by that is, ideally, so for example, if you're the Philadelphia Public School Notebook, which is an INN member in Philly that's focused purely on the Philadelphia school system, they do take advertising, but the advertising is specific to the target audience, which is basically educators and parents, and isn't just sort of the general and the belly fat type of ads you see on a lot of websites. So there is a push to earn revenue, and that is quite a diversified area. So such areas, things as events. Events are great because it provides you visibility in the community, often is a great extension of the community type focus that you're doing with your news. And by the way, not every INN member is community based. I want to make sure I'm clear on that.
Right.
So events, advertising, corporate sponsorships, and things like training even. There's a member in Boston, the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, and they run summer investigative training workshops for high school kids and also for foreign journalists. And that's a revenue generator for them. And they use that to help underwrite the investigations they'll do through the remainder of the year. So we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of experimentation in the earned revenue side of things. The third sort of leg of the stool, as it were, is really focused on what I call direct revenue. So you could call that membership, you could call that subscriptions. It's also purchasing tickets to events. It's purchasing or downloading apps and doing in-app purchases. But the idea of monetization of the very people that you serve has, for those communities that can do it, and I think there's a big caveat there, probably in the long term the most promise and where we're seeing a lot of innovation.
Right. So to get to for those communities who can do it, I mean, the various sort of models you sort of talked about, whether it's local foundation, whether it's sort of like in sort of active, reasonably affluent membership base. I mean, these all sort of it makes sense as no surprise, I guess, but sort of it sounds like the sort of opportunities for success for nonprofit media are strongest, in communities that already have sort of like strong functioning civic institutions, and sort of higher levels of engagement, that sort of stuff. So, and you would expect commercial media to be best positioned to succeed in those sorts of communities as well. So it's not, sort of like a unique challenge, but to the extent that and you didn't make this claim, but to the extent that, you sort of think about, well, maybe nonprofits could sort of help fill, news deserts or things like that.
Right.
That may be a challenging proposition.
Well, it's definitely a challenge, right? I mean, I would, I don't want to sort of sugarcoat this. And so, on one hand, we have to find models that provide the ability for these organizations to reduce their need for a lot of foundation support, right? So we want these organizations to be able to stand alone. Now, in areas where you have, often, for example, we have a couple of members that are in large media markets, but are serving underserved communities within those large markets. So, for example, City Limits in the New York area has a long history of serving underserved communities within that media space, and Oakland Local on the West Coast, likewise. And so, just because you're in a market where there is existing commercial media doesn't mean to say that commercial media are serving the audiences that need this type of information. So that's one point. But as it relates to news deserts, what we are very pleased to see is when we first started, we tended to see membership in frankly where journalists were living in the sort of West Coast, East Coast. Now we're seeing these nonprofits spring up across the country in states that are colored red, blue, and purple. And so recently New Mexico and Arizona and Kentucky and other places. So as we see more and more nonprofits starting, they are starting in areas that have been typically underserved, but their ability to monetize directly, of course, still is limited. And so what that really boils down to is that there is no one prescription, there is no one size fits all for these individual nonprofits, and that what we try and do is provide them access and training on the spectrum so they can figure out what makes most sense for them. So, for example, we were really fortunate this year to have the Knight Foundation give us $1 million to re-grant for business experimentation in nonprofits. If you're a for-profit, you can get angel funding, you can get, you can even go to the bank and get a loan that's securitized. Nonprofits generally don't have access to that kind of experimentation capital. And so we're giving these sort of micro grants that are up to $35,000 with the idea that we can help seed some more innovation and experimentation within revenue generation, and that those lessons can be sort of spread and taught to others so that we can increase the pie.
Gotcha. What's the institution in Kentucky, just out of curiosity, the new member you have there?
It's Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting, based out of Louisville, I believe.
Gotcha. And so for a publication like that, so how does for something like that, just to sort of put some more specifics on it, so
right,
where do they get their initial funding? What's their sort of plan for sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I believe, and I don't want to speak specifically to that one because I don't have that right in front of me. Right,
kind of put you on
generally,
spot there.
Of course, but generally what they will do is, and this is, I think, quite I wouldn't say typical because everything's changing on a regular basis, but what we're seeing of
Hmm.
late is they'll get a grant from a foundation, maybe it's a national foundation, maybe it's a topical local foundation. Generally those initial grants are 100,000, maybe they got a couple of them $200,000. But in their case and in others, what they're doing is they're immediately starting forming relationships with local public media and with local
Hmm.
commercial media in order to collaborate, but more importantly, to leverage those partners to make sure that the journalism they produce actually reaches an audience. One thing
Right.
that is another key factor here is that most of these organizations produce content on a regular basis, but certainly nowhere near at the velocity or to the audience size that a commercial news organization does. It takes a long time and a lot of effort to produce true investigative journalism, and even enterprise level and other sort of and data journalism. These are time-consuming endeavors. So what happens as a result is they don't get a tremendous amount of traffic necessarily on their own websites, and so partnering and collaborating helps them sort of do a couple of things. First of all, it increases the impact of their work because they're inherently able to work with other organizations and actually you leverage those organizations for a larger reach. It therefore helps with their impact because we are interestingly in the impact business. We people, funders, and these nonprofit institutions, membership, want to demonstrate that they provide social good. And that's very tricky in journalism, right? So it's hard to know, for example, it's hard to prove a negative. So if we didn't have these folks on the job, what would happen if is not as easy to prove as saying, okay, we were able to produce this story through this partner and we know that it reached X millions of households.
Right.
So, and then the last part is the ability to use those collaborations to justify their ability to reach folks and therefore get increased investment.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, so the sort of partnership and model is not something sort of new to the sort of like local nonprofit media institutions like Center for Public Integrity, sort of a sort of national nonprofit. It's been around a long time. And does that all the time, right? Sort of producing in concert with other publications. ProPublica is newer, but sort of they produce, and they probably have pretty substantial sort of traffic to their own site at this point, but still sort of produce in sort of share material with other publications
That's right.
as well. So it's sort of a well-established um, sort of model. Um, Kevin, you and I had a conversation sort of a while ago offline, and one of the things that you said that struck me then, I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit now, sort of the question between with some of these nonprofits, whether they're built to, whether they're built sort of small shops that are built, for one person's career or for to like tackle a particular sort of project or issue while it's in the news, or whether they're sort of like institutions that are intended to last for a long time. And I wonder, yeah, I may be sort of like misremembering exactly the point you were making then, but even something you talked about the Philadelphia schools site a little bit earlier, and I'm not that familiar with that site, but so I don't know what their ambitions are, but I would imagine that when you have that sort of like issue oriented thing, both the audience enthusiasm and frankly perhaps the funder enthusiasm for something like that is going to potentially wax and wane, depending on sort of like how much currency that education or educational reform or whatever it may be has in the sort of like broader political and civic discussion at the time. Is that the case? And what sort of advice do you give organizations about how to sort of think about those questions?
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question. And it's something that we tackle with a lot. I mean, I think that if we're going to be very honest with ourselves, not every organization was started with a clear end game in mind, right? I mean, this is part of actually what things we train people who are doing these projects and startups, which is, what is it? What does success look like to you? Is it actually something that is a permanent piece, or is it once you've achieved something that can then some dissipate? So not every nonprofit obviously is a permanent institution. I think, frankly, most of the organizations that are members of INN would like to think that they're creating something that's bigger than the individuals that created it, that it actually serves the community and belongs to the community, and therefore should be long-lived. But frankly, we've also seen mergers and acquisitions recently of organizations that were doing well, but made the calculus that it made more sense for them to actually merge with and become part of, in this case, public media stations. And I'm referring specifically to the St. Louis Beacon, which is now part of St. Louis Public Media, I believe, based at the University of St. Louis, and then also the Rocky Mountain Investigative News Network, which is now part of Rocky Mountain PBS. The calculus there really was we're going to have access to a larger audience, more regular income, and be able to do more journalism to meet the mission. So at the end of the day, it's up to every executive director to sort of determine for themselves if they, what the end game is. And what we try and do, frankly, is train them to think that way, as opposed to just focus on, keeping the journalism alive. And I think that, again, there's why people start these projects and the function that they serve and why people would fund them are three different things. And what we're trying to do is bring those together so that they are all in concert to give them the greatest chance of success.
Yeah. We actually wrote about the St. Louis Beacon merger, and it was an interesting situation, right, in which you had public media institutions in I don't remember off the top, and actually I shouldn't. St. Louis Public Radio has done some really with their prior existing staff has done some really important work on sort of death penalty transparency in particular, which we've also written about. But many public media outlets don't have a huge reporting staff. What they do have is that sort of long-standing audience relationship and an understanding about how to basically monetize an audience relationship by more or less begging for member donations, a couple times a year, and in that case, the merger sort of brought the sort of considerable reporting capacity that the Beacon had, within St. Louis Public Media, and it meant that the Beacon didn't have to, essentially establish, as I'm understanding it, and you may remember it better than I do, but we've seen some other sort of public media nonprofit institutions like Voice of San Diego go towards that sort of public media membership model, but in that case, merging with the existing public media outlet may have made more sense than trying to develop that model yourself.
Yeah, I mean, and the jury's still out as to long term whether that's going to be sustainable there too. So, for example, there's another organization called Investigative News Source, which is also down in San Diego. They are actually housed within KPBS down there. They have a shared headcount, but they're still separate entities. And I think in that case, the executive director and the board there made the calculus, well, we want to work with public media, but we don't necessarily want to bet our future on that, or they would be concerned potentially about when the emphasis within public media moves away from investigative or community, what does that mean for those projects? So, I think it's still kind of early days there. We definitely think there's tremendous synergies, and we encourage INN members to reach out and work collaboratively with their public media, and they do so also with commercial media, because obviously there's a tremendous amount of parallel the mission there. But again, there is no clear game plan in the long term as to how this continues. And we are looking to find ways to constantly increase the number of revenue streams and reduce the dependence on outside entities for long-term stability.
Right. How in terms of the revenue stream question, so as I mentioned before, Texas Tribune has begun doing sort of sponsored content in its opinion section. And obviously many sort of commercial media outlets are experimenting with native ads and sponsored content and stuff like that. There is a sense that not well nonprofits, right? And I should say, stipulates so CJR is a nonprofit institution as well, and I'm not involved in our revenue, sort of revenue considerations, but I know that we're looking for alternative sort of streams as well. There's a sort of, I guess, potentially sort of like a sense or an impression that as a nonprofit, you might take a very sort of, well, there's a sort of sense of like goody-goody, like goo-goo or whatever, attitudes about nonprofit, or you're always going to take a sort of pure. I'm stumbling over this a lot.
Yeah, I think I know you're going with this.
Do you offer guidance to your members about sort of how to think about new ethical questions that may be presented by some of sort of the new revenue opportunities or sort of approaches that media organizations more broadly are taking?
Yeah. Now, what we don't do is we don't dictate what INM members should do, other than those sort of three things I talked about earlier: transparency, be a nonprofit, and actually do the investigative journalism. That said, when we do business training for these organizations, and we start to look at the individual revenue streams, we're also quick to point out the pitfalls, right? So advertising has pitfalls, and it has both tax implications and non-tax implications, and and the like. But there are also implications with accepting money from certain foundations or individuals, and we've seen this play out in sort of media circles. There's the reality of the checks and balances and the firewalls that you put in to make sure that there is editorial independence, that there's a clear conflict of interest. We go to great lengths to help our organizations make sure that when people give them money, the expectations are set up front, and that should any one funder want to have any undue influence, we advise them to walk away from that money. There is definitely bad money to be had out there. They can't just take every penny that walks through the door. So that's one issue. The second issue, of course, is the appearance issue, whereby even if they go to these great lengths to have these conflict of interest policies and to make sure that there is an undue influence, plenty of people will look to draw lines between the agendas of the source of the money and the reporting. And
right.
At the end of the day, our commitment to transparency is really based upon the idea that informed citizens make up their own mind about the quality of and the ethics behind the journalism, that we really don't have anything to hide, and we stand behind our journalism. We can't stop people drawing those conclusions. It's their right to try and do that, but our hope is that the journalism stands on its own 2 feet. That isn't to say that some organizations within INN would take some monies that others would walk away from.
Right.
Again, we don't dictate those terms, but we certainly do what we can to educate the folks and make sure they're thinking through those implications and mitigate any potential risk up front.
Yeah, that's right. So, right. I mean, I sort of phrased it as the ethical sort of questions related to sort of new models. But I mean, there's sort of the basic, you get a lot of money from a foundation or a philanthropist or something like that is a very sort of traditional nonprofit funding model. And there are, sort of potential ethical questions or sort of conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest questions related to that as well. Have to be managed and addressed.
Yeah, and on the commercial side, I mean, for example, I don't know of any INM member that does training or does sort of special reports. I don't know any of them that will take money from an organization that they might be potentially reporting on, right? Or even advertising or corporate sponsorship. So I think for the vast majority of INM members, and really I don't think I've seen anything that is cringeworthy or questionable. I think, frankly, most of these organizations understand that their reputation is extremely important, and therefore, can't afford to take money that potentially undermines their credibility with the audience.
Got it. Kevin, we've been talking for a little while, and what else in this vein should we get to in this conversation? Like,
Well,
what do you is? Go ahead.
There's one of the interesting things that we're trying to do also is trying to help people understand how journalism can even be nonprofit. Why should they care? Why should they give? Right? There are many worthy social causes, and the philanthropy sector is expected to do more and more, particularly in this age of reducing government roles and funding. So it's not a very easy value proposition when you meet people. Say, oh, what do you do? I'm a journalist, and we're a nonprofit. Would you give? There's some real confusion there. So another really key point here, which I think is for the audience, is that we are here. The nonprofit organizations are here because we understand that there is more than to journalism than just making money or even just surviving. That we play a unique role in society. That we have an active role in keeping democracy free, and keep corruption at bay through accountability. And so, that is not to say that there aren't great commercial organizations doing investigative journalism. Of course, there are. We don't dominate the market. We see ourselves very much like in hospitals. You'll have for-profit and non-profits in the same industry. You'll have for-profit and non-profits in theaters and other places too. So this is not something unique. But I do think it's important for people to understand that our democracy hinges on not just the free flow of information, but the ability to push back, ask questions, make sure that we're not being whitewashed. So, for example, right now we're seeing a lot of movement towards open government, and open government is fantastic. But it's still the government giving data out. They're still picking and choosing what that data is. You still need independent voices out there asking the tough questions that have the domain expertise. So because, frankly, the average citizen doesn't have necessarily the time or the depth of understanding to be able to ask those questions for themselves. And that's a really important point.
Right. And I mean, as you're saying that, I'm thinking for-profit or, sort of traditional commercial media institutions, I think, are having to make a similar case more and more. Right, in that the advertising revenue is under pressure, clearly going to continue to be under pressure. I think the New York Times now the Times now gets more revenue from readers than it does from advertisers. Most other institutions are not there yet, but the trend is in that direction, and so the broader sort of sense of needing to make a case for journalism as something that's sort of socially valuable to support, I think is something that's felt by both for-profit and not-profit media.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Cool.
I really do. And I think, and then in the day of, here we are, we're sitting on, these machines and we're talking to each other this way. But the fact is, we also appreciate that more people are going to get their news right now through social and mobile than they ever will from going directly to a news organization's website per se. And so that also has another dynamic, how when people discover content without necessarily understanding right away what the source of that information is or the ethics behind that organization, how do you train the average citizen to be able to be discerning? And I think actually a lot of journalists have a hard time with this, but I personally think this is a good thing, that people are more and more trusting their peers that have credibility with them for referral of information. And so the idea of the opinion maker, the informed and vocal contributor, I guess even citizen journalist, that is actually something that we need to embrace as community-based and topical-based nonprofit news organizations.
Cool. All right, Kevin. We should probably wrap up, but it's been really it's been good talking to you about this.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it.
All right, great. Talk to you again soon.
Talk soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.